So I'm one of the co-founders of Chow Locally. I'm also an assistant professor of nutrition at Arizona State University. So as part of Chow Locally, but also as a prof at ASU, my whole focus is food systems and food system sustainability. So what I wanted to talk about primarily today was, I'm going to hint at Chow Locally and what we do at the very end, but really what I want to talk about is our food system and the food environment, and how this environment around us actually impacts pretty strongly the food choices that we make, healthy or unhealthy, and then how that also then impacts the overall environment in terms of land use, water use, and things like that. So I've got a ton of slides and not a lot of time. I'll probably plow through, but if you have questions, just stop me. I don't care if we get through all the content or not. I'd rather just go back and forth and talk. So either way is fine. Okay, so yeah, I'll talk about our food environment. I want to talk then about how it affects our food choice, because a lot of times we tend to think we make our own food choices. We have lots of food around us. We decide what and when and how to eat. I'll make the argument that actually that's not the case, that in fact most of the time what we eat is pretty much dictated to us. We actually make very few autonomous food choices. And then I'm going to talk about how that affects both health and sustainability, and then solutions related to that, where I'll talk a little bit about the Chow Locally. But first, to be a little interactive, feel free to scream out the obvious. What do you see here? Grocery store? Exactly. Nothing particularly remarkable about it. It's just an aisle in a grocery store. Maybe it's a nicer grocery store, but still just an aisle in a grocery store. But there are some pretty remarkable things about it when you think about it. Can you name some qualities of this picture that you consider to be remarkable? Any ideas? Choice. Okay, lots of variety of food. Anything else? The way it's displayed. Boxes, good. Packaging, good. So those are some key things. Lots of variety here. An incredible number of foods in this one grocery store aisle. Of the dozen or so in this grocery store, multiply that by the thousands and thousands of grocery stores all around the country. These are an incredible number of food choices around us, most of which, as we can see, are packaged processed foods, not necessarily whole foods, right? It's sort of emblematic of the food environment that most of us operate in most of the time. Certainly not all of us. There are lots of people that deal with issues of food insecurity, which is a whole other talk. But this is really a food environment we deal with most of the time. And to define it a bit more, the food environment, when I use that term, it's really the totality of available foods that are around us, as well as their placement, their promotion, all the places we can find them, the types of foods, so healthy and unhealthy foods, fresh or processed foods, the corner markets and convenience stores and grocery stores and big box stores that we can buy this stuff at, cafeterias and restaurants, even non-food stores we find food at. Why would I include non-food stores? Walgreens, right? Gas station, Barnes & Noble, Best Buy, Staples, any of these places you go, presumably to buy something other than food, gas or books or Staples, maybe, you end up having to make a choice whether you're going to buy some food or not, because even when you go to Best Buy, maybe to buy, whatever, a DVD or something, you go to the cash register, you have to pass by like 15 feet of racks of food, and usually the least healthy food, right? Candies and sodas and things like that. So they're a really important piece of a food environment that we have to deal with all the time. This food environment is really built to maximize consumption of food, and in fact, maximize overconsumption of food. And there are some qualities of the food environment that are particularly focused on by food industry and otherwise. And I want to focus on some of these, including flavor, variety, large portions, and then visibility and proximity. And it's kind of hard to see the picture that I have here, but this is my favorite grocery store aisle. It's emblematic of some of these qualities. The cereal aisle. The number of choices that we have for cereal are ridiculous. In particular, it's really hard to see, but the mini wheats, how many people eat mini wheats? They're good, right? There's something like a dozen different varieties of frosted mini wheats, if you didn't know. So you've got your regular and your frosted mini wheats and your vanilla cream and strawberry cream and chocolate and fruit in the middle, and it goes on and on. And if you didn't know this, if you weren't happy with the mininess of your mini wheats, there are in fact mini wheats. They're bite-sized mini wheats for kids. So there's no shortage of variety of cereals that we can choose from. But first, let's talk about flavor and how flavor is maximized in our food environment. So humans innately prefer sweet foods. Can you guess why? Calories and energy, good. So carbohydrate, sugar, is a primary and initial source of energy for us in energy metabolism. So it makes sense that we would prefer that kind of food. We also quickly learn to enjoy salty foods and fatty foods. Fat, again, is also an energy source, sort of a more long-term energy source. Sodium is a really important electrolyte in all sorts of metabolic processes. So these are things we innately like to eat, and it makes sense. Food industry, of course, is savvy, and so food companies will make foods that highlight these particular flavor attributes. All right, it's just good business. It's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it makes most sense because that's what people like to buy. And as an example of that, how that impacts the food environment, this is from an Institute of Medicine report from a few years back. Between 1994 and 2004, there were over 1,500, actually 1,600 new candy products introduced to the U.S. food market. During that same decade, only about 50 new fruit and vegetable products were introduced to the market. So it's obvious where food innovation dollars go, primarily to foods that are least healthy because they maximize added sugars, solid fats, sodium, those sorts of nutrients that aren't bad in moderation, but we unfortunately overconsume them because they're so prevalent and so cheap in our food environment. Variety is another attribute of our food environment that is really maximized. So when variety is introduced in terms of food, we eat more. Can you give me a good example of this?
A salad bar?
Salad
like
bar.
a buffet line?
Yeah, buffets.
Buffet, yeah. How about a good holiday?
Oh, yeah.
Thanksgiving maybe, Christmas too. I mean, various holidays, usually we have lots and lots of food available to us, but a buffet is a really good example. So if you have just a couple of food choices in front of you, you'll take some amount of that, but if you have 5, 7, 10 food choices available in front of you, you'll pick at all those things, and maybe take smaller portions of each, but generally you'll end up over-consuming. You'll consume more total amount of food and calories than you would if you had fewer choices. And there's a researcher named Barbara Rolls, who I think is at Penn State University. She's done research in this area, and she's come up with a theory called sensory-specific satiety. So the idea here is when you have a couple of foods available in front of you, the sensory aspects of those foods are pretty minimal. There's only a certain number of flavor attributes, mouthfeel, texture, smell, even visual, colors, and things like that. But if you have lots of different foods, you have many, many more of those attributes. And so it's less easy to become satiated on any one of those sensory attributes than if you have fewer choices in front of you. And so she's actually done a whole lot of studies on this. Rolls is one of them. Brian Wansink, if you've ever heard of him, he's a really quirky researcher who's written a couple books on this. He's looked at variety too, and he's found basically the same thing. And he's done really interesting research, Wansink. He actually has done work with M&Ms. He's built a whole career on candy research. But what he's done is actually put bowls of M&Ms in front of people. And when the bowl of M&Ms is filled with a mixed colors of M&Ms versus when it's just one color, people eat more M&Ms. And we all know all M&Ms, whether they're brown or orange or blue, whatever, they all taste the same. Right? But people will still eat more calories worth, significantly more calories worth of candy if there's just different colors in front of them versus one color. So these different sensory aspects are really impactful. And those researchers have done this work in adults. Before I came to ASU, came out here, I was at Yale University and I was doing research at a place called the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity. And we were interested in this particular issue, this idea of variety and sensory-specific satiety. And so we actually ran a study while we were there in kids to see if the same thing would hold up in children. And we used this product here called Munchies. Who's heard of Munchies? Or loves Munchies? I'd never heard of them until we ran this study, and I quickly realized when I present the same sort of stuff to my students at ASU, they're like, oh yeah, we grew up on this stuff. Okay, that's the generation gap right there. But if you've not heard of Munchies, what it is basically variety in a bag for kids. So this particular product here has Cheetos and Captain Crunch and Doritos and pretzels all in a bag mixed together. So what we did was we took 8 to 10-year-old kids and we sat them down on 2 different eating occasions a week separated. On one eating occasion, we took them down in a room with a children's TV show that they'd watch for about 45 minutes. And they'd have a bowl in front of them filled with this Munchies product that we pre-weighed. And they could eat ad libitum, as much as they wanted to for that 45-minute period of time. The second eating occasion, again, 1 week removed, we'd sit them down, all the same experimental conditions, except in this case, we gave them only one constituent of the Munchies mix. So just the Cheetos or just the Captain Crunch. And then we weighed how much they consumed of that. And these are the results. So if you look at the amount of grams that they consumed, the average of eating one single constituent was about 72 grams. That compared to the mixture, which is about 105 grams worth of the food. When you translate that into calories consumed, the kilocalories for the single constituent, it was on average about 344, 345 calories consumed, which is a lot for an 8 to 10-year-old kid in 45 minutes. But if you look at the mixture, they ate 200 calories worth more than that. 540 calories of snack food in 45 minutes, just because there was a mix involved. So this is really impactful in how children eat as well. You think about the types of foods children are exposed to, it's a whole lot of variety of a whole lot of unhealthy foods, basically. So this is what they're contending with all the time. Now this is not just a human thing. So this happens in animals as well. There was this classic study done in the 80s where researchers took genetically identical rodents and they separated them into two groups. And in one group, they gave the rodents it's a standard pelleted diet. Basically contains all of the nutrients rodents need to grow and thrive normally. And they would put piles of this food in their cages and just let them eat ad libitum as much as they wanted to over a period of weeks. They gave the second group of rats, again genetically identical, literally this. So it's the pelleted diet plus like Cheetos and Snickers and Oreos and peanut butter and chocolate all in a big pile and let them eat, again, ad libitum for a period of weeks. And the result was phenomenal. Basically, the rats that had the mix became obese, literally became obese. All of their satiation mechanisms were entirely overrun, and they became obese. The other rats that had a pelleted diet were able to self-regulate. They would eat and then essentially stop when they were full, and they maintained a normal growth curve. What was interesting about this, though, is that when the researchers took away this mixed junk food diet and just gave the obese rats the standard pelleted diet, their weight actually came down again. But not all the way. It would come down pretty close to where the control rats were, but still they maintained a little bit higher weight. So they were able to sort of recoup the normal growth curve. So variety is really powerful, and as you know, variety is around us all the time in terms of food choice. Large portions is another really important factor in our food environment, and this is one you've heard plenty about, organs for a lock and supersizing and those sorts of things. But it's one of these factors that continually exists, will always exist in our food environment, and it sort of makes a lot of sense in terms of this value-added concept that's built in. And so if you think about, McDonald's, say, and you buy a large soda there, I'm not sure what it costs, let's say $1.50. To supersize it, maybe it's 20 cents more, right? But you, as a consumer, for 20 cents, you get a whole lot more Coca-Cola. And so it makes a lot of sense to maybe supersize that because you're getting more bang for your buck. On McDonald's end, how much does it cost them to give you a little bit more syrup and water? Pennies, maybe, right? So they're making a whole lot of profit on that supersizing, value that they're offering customers. Multiply that across the, billion served, and you're talking a lot of money. So the supersizing concept makes a whole lot of sense, essentially on both ends. But the examples that are out there in the environment are funny, to me, I guess. The gulp from 7-Eleven is one of my favorite examples, because you start out with this 16-ounce gulp, and then as time goes on, you get the big gulp, which is 32 ounces, then the super big gulp, which is 44 ounces. Then you require a handle on your vat of soda, which is 52 ounces, the extreme gulp. But then weirdly, anticlimactically, it's just the double gulp at 64 ounces. But it's not like this is old news. I mean, it's still happening. So Starbucks, right? They used to have the 3 sizes, the small one, whatever it was, and the grande and the venti. Now they've got the Trenta, right? Which just sounds massive, Trenta. So it continues to happen. You go to gas stations, I find anymore, you see more and more the king-size versions of candy bars. Or you go to a vending machine to buy a bottle or a can of soda. It used to be the 12-ounce cans were the standard. You rarely find that anymore. Now it's the 20-ounce bottle is pretty much the standard what you get in the vending machine. So portion size continues to grow. And I haven't even talked about the restaurant. So to go back to Brian Wansink, these are more overt factors in our environment that are sort of maximized to cause overconsumption. But there are subtle factors as well. Wansink likes to study this sort of stuff, these subtle factors that subconsciously almost cause us to eat more food. And a couple of those things include proximity and visibility. So again, he does these experiments with candies. Well, he took candies that were in a glass bowl, and he ran a study with this. And so he took a receptionist's office where a few people were working, and he had put out, sort of in the middle of the room on a counter, a glass bowl full of candy. And in one occasion, that glass bowl was clear. You could see the candy through the bowl. And everybody knew what was in the bowl when he introduced it. It was filled with candy. Now, on a second occasion, he would put a glass bowl full of candy, but this one was opaque. And again, people knew there was candy in the bowl, but this time, just looking over at it, you can't immediately see the candy in the bowl. But what happened was people in the condition in which the glass bowl was clear would eat significantly more calories with the candy. Everybody knows there's candy in the jar, whether it's clear or opaque. But people eat more when there's just the visual cue. That's all it took for people to eat significantly more calories of, essentially an unhealthy food. So even these little subtle visual factors can prompt us in ways we don't even think about. Proximity is also a really important one. I have no idea why I've never changed this picture. I've got like this early 80s computer room. Sorry about that. But he also ran a study in an office in which he'd put glass bowls of candy right next to a computer of a worker. And that person could just sort of eat throughout the day however much they wanted. And then in a second condition, he'd take that bowl of candy and he'd move it just a few feet out of the way so that you have to like scoot over in your rolling chair to grab some candy out of the jar. So it wasn't necessarily within arm's reach. Here again, when the candy is right there for you to just grab and eat, you would eat significantly more calories worth of the candy versus if you had to just get up, walk 2 feet over, and grab candy and then go back to your seat. So that proximity thing, is subtle though it is, still really important in how it impacts your food choices, how much you actually eat. And you translate that to the broader food environment. Again, going back to a grocery store, or Best Buy, or Staples, or Barnes & Noble, wherever you go, you literally can do this, or this, or this, and pick up that food as you're on your way out, right? So that proximity issue is really important. And in fact, in grocery stores, I think it was Bashas who told me this one time. In the sort of aisle that you walk up to the cash register, each of those slots has usually one type of candy or something in it. $10,000 a month for one of those slots in terms of sales. So it's huge, it's big money for each of those slots of candy. That's one of their major money makers. So it's a really important spot, and it makes sense then to maximize that proximity so people will easily pick that up and eat. There are lots of other influences that I'm not covering, but one that I think is really probably most important of all of these is advertising in terms of influencing us in terms of how much to eat, what to eat, where to eat, with whom to eat, when to eat, and even what's appropriate at what times to eat. Messages from science and from the government are all about healthy eating. So we have the dietary guidelines, we have what used to be My Pyramid, it's now My Plate. But these really can't contend with advertising out there because food industry spends a lot of money to advertise their foods to us. And they're getting savvier and savvier and taking every opportunity to do so because their margins of profit are getting thinner and thinner. And there's a reason for that. Over time, although things are changing now, over the past century, prices for food and how much we spend on food has drastically decreased. So at the beginning of last century, we spent nearly half of our take-home income on food for consumption at home. These days, we're spending between 10 and 13% of our take-home income. So drastically less. That means, competing for those fewer dollars that we're spending on food is all the more important for food companies. And so their advertising is becoming stronger and stronger and literally teaches us what to eat, which I will try to prove to you now. So what I'm going to do now is show you a series of slides. And on each slide, there's going to be the beginning of a phrase. So I'll read the beginning of the phrase off, and I want you, whoever's participating, to complete the phrase for me, all right, as a group. Let's try it out. Snap, crackle.
I like
Yeah, so what are we talking about here? That's just correct. Exactly. Pretty easy to finish that one. How about silly rabbit?
Tricks or kids.
Good. Obviously, we're talking about tricks. How about they're magically?
Delicious.
Great. Lucky Charms, right? Now with bigger marshmallows. I'm cuckoo for?
Cocoa Puffs.
Very good. Obviously, what we're talking about here is advertising of children's cereals, usually sugary cereals. This is one of my favorite pictures, this Cocoa Puffs picture. Can you even tell what the food looks like? There's like maybe 2 or 3 kernels right up here that tell you what Cocoa Puffs actually look like. Otherwise, you can't even tell what it is you're about to consume out of this box. Instead, what you've got slapped across the front of this front of package label is this whole grain claim. Who are they advertising to?
Parents.
Yeah, exactly, parents. They've already, they've decided they've already sold the kid on the product, right? And it makes sense because you were just able to complete for me without almost thinking about it, the phrase. You already know what Cocoa Puffs are. You've been taught that already. So now it's time to teach parents, you keep hearing this is a sugary cereal. It's not. It's really healthy. Look, there's whole grains in it. And then if you look in the upper right-hand corner, we've got this goodness corner that has all this symbology on it telling us it's full of whole grain. It's They're hard to read, but it's high in B vitamins, it's high in calcium. Never mind that all of that was stripped out of the original grains that made the cereal and then synthetically added back in later. But we're being sold on Cocoa Puffs as an incredibly healthy food, right? So they're selling to the kid now and to the parent with this sort of stuff. One more just to see if you can get this one. There.
Great.
Good.
Katie wins.
Yeah, you are on this.
I only ate cereal as a child. That's all I eat.
This one I think is pretty incredible because once you have a little bit of context in just one word, at least some people can get what this catchphrase is, and obviously it's Frosted Flakes. So actually, I'll tell you a little bit of a not so tangential story, but if you're not yet convinced of the power of advertisement to teach us what to eat, there are stories out there about advertisement, how in fact they tell us what's appropriate to eat at what times. So there's a story about bacon and eggs, actually. Anybody know the history of bacon and eggs? When I say bacon and eggs, what meal do you think of?
Breakfast.
Breakfast. Why breakfast? Because that's when you eat bacon and eggs. Because it's breakfast. Because you eat bacon and eggs. Right? So it's this kind of classic American breakfast. We assume it to be as such, that, you know, farmers back in the day, you know, 1700s, 1800s, they must have been eating this stuff when they were settling the lands and that kind of thing. Well, no, in fact, what I'll try and convince you of now is that bacon and eggs are not a classic American breakfast, but a PR trick based on Freudian concepts of the subconscious mind. Okay? So back in the early 1900s, there was a company called the Beech Nut Packing Company, and they sold, among other products, bacon products, pork and bacon. And at the time, their sales were flagging. So they weren't selling as much bacon as they wanted to. Usually what a company does to move more product off the shelf, they would have a sale, or the price, people buy more, right? They took a different tack. Instead, what they did was hire a guy named Edward Bernays. Anybody heard of Edward Bernays? Yeah, a few people have. Considered the father of PR. He had these considerable ties to the newspaper industry, which was a major way information was delivered to people back then, right? And he worked with companies to help fashion sort of a public image. So they hired him, and instead of, you know, suggesting that they have a sale, what he decided to do was do more of an informational campaign, and he decided to use psychological concepts, because in fact his uncle was Sigmund Freud. So he thought back to the days in Austria when he was walking the hills with Uncle Freud, learning about Freud's theories of psychology, which were very different, right, than sort of standard psychological theory at the time. Standard theory was that people were very rational. Right? They were presented with a problem, they gather information, go through a step-by-step process, come to a conclusion, take action. That was kind of it. Freud said, no, 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 we are really weird, and we have all these subconscious needs and desires, and we operate more on those than in any rational way. And you know sort of all the avenues of that. But one of the things he focused on was this subconscious need for security when it came to health. And people attached this innate sense of security to doctors and doctors' opinions. Doctors were God when it came to health. In the early 1900s, and to an extent they still are, maybe even more so. So people derived a sort of an innate sense of security in terms of their health when they talked and listened to doctors. So what Bernays did was he fashioned a one-question survey. Those of you who know survey design, one question, very reliable and very robust. I'm being facetious. A one-question survey, and he asked doctors, do you support a hearty breakfast for Americans or a lean breakfast for Americans? Because at the time, Americans were consuming maybe toast and butter, jam, juice or coffee, and that's kind of it for breakfast. So really lean. And if you think about this, in the early 1900s, we're not dealing with issues of overnutrition, right, and obesity. We're dealing with issues of undernutrition, food insecurity, nutrient deficiencies. So doctors universally responded to the survey by saying, yeah, we support a hearty breakfast for Americans. Bernays then took that information and constructed his own idea of what a hearty breakfast would be, bacon and eggs. And then he used his considerable newspaper ties to go on this informational campaign to educate Americans that doctors recommend they consume bacon and eggs for breakfast. Thus, bacon and eggs was born as this classic American breakfast, right? So the punchline is you can go to IHOP now and see Freud written all over the menu. But that's where bacon and eggs come from. So even though we sort of conceive of it as an appropriate breakfast to consume, really, it was just PR that told us that that was the case. So advertising is really powerful. You were able to rattle off these catchphrases of sugary cereals for kids without a problem, without even thinking about it. But can you describe for me the 3 major goals for Americans' healthy diets that come out of Dietary Guidelines for Americans, just updated in 2010? Probably not, and my nutrition students generally can't. There are three main messages. The first is to balance calories, and usually balancing intake with physical activity. The second is to increase consumption of certain foods, so fruits and vegetables and whole grains. These are, once you hear them, you're like, oh yeah, I've heard that message before. The third then is to limit intake of certain nutrients, including added sugars, solid fats, and sodium, and the foods that those come from. But we have a hard time naming what these simple messages are. We, without thinking about it, can name off all these catchphrases for all these different cereals. And so why is that? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. The government spends maybe $300 million total each year on promoting dietary guidance. And that would include My Plate, that would include dietary guidelines for Americans, and to maybe a lesser extent, it would include the nutrition facts labels that you see on food products. Compare that, though, to the collected tens of billions of dollars that food industry spends advertising its food. There's not going to be any competition there. So it's obvious who's actually teaching us what to eat, and how much, and when. Right? And with the gender roles that are still attached to foods in the U.S. and abroad, also with whom, what we should be eating with whom. Makes me think there was a Burger King ad a while back, and a woman comes up to a man and offers him a salad. And he turns it away, and he's like, no, woman, I need my meat, right? And he gets up, and he grabs a burger from somewhere. And he literally goes walking out to the street and starts marching. And if you've seen this commercial, right? He's marching with the burger, talking about how he needs his meat, and all these men begin to join him, right? Obvious gender roles. There's no reason men need to eat meat and women need to eat salads, right? And have sensual experiences with chocolate. That's sort of the advertisement shtick that people use to promote certain foods among certain populations. Okay, why is all of this important? All these factors that promote overconsumption in our environment? Well, it's a couple of things. One is health outcomes. The other is impacts on the environment in terms of food production. If you look at how we meet goals in the dietary guidelines, we do a pretty poor job. And I would contend it's because of this really powerful environment that exists around us. If you look at the food groups and the nutrients that we should be consuming more of, we fail miserably in terms of meeting the goals, the promoted goals in the dietary guidelines. So whole grains, for example, we eat 15% of the goal set for the average American adult. Compare that to nutrients that we should be limiting in our diet. So refined grains, for example, or saturated solid fats and added sugars. We're over-consuming solid fats and added sugars 280%. All right, so 180% over what we should be consuming. 100% over what we should be consuming in terms of refined grains. So we're doing a pretty bad job when it comes to that. The problem in the U.S. is that we focus so much on the individual. We look at these data and we say, boy, people are really bad at keeping themselves healthy. It's an individual failure, a character flaw, somehow, that they are now overweight and obese and fail to eat healthy foods and always overconsume unhealthy foods. I'm showing you all these data to suggest that the food environment is really powerful in dictating what you're eating. So much so that if you want to maintain your own weight, it becomes really, really difficult unless you have the time, the money, and the social network to constantly, consistently fight against the environment that is built to make you overweight. And to sort of highlight that, if you look at all the sources of added sugars in our diet, to take one of these nutrients as an example, 35% or almost 36% are coming from sugary beverages, so sports drinks and sodas primarily, along with some other ones. And then processed foods would make up the rest, the majority of the rest of the contribution. And actually, I think it's among teenagers, U.S. teenagers consume 40% of their calories as added sugars. Nearly half of their diet comes from added sugars, primarily through sodas and sugary beverages. So if you wonder why there's so much promotion of policies within schools to limit, sales of sugary beverages throughout the school day, that would be one of the major reasons. How about solid fats? So I'm talking saturated fats, trans fats, those fats that are really impactful on your blood cholesterol, which high blood cholesterol is a risk factor for heart disease. If you look at sources for this, by the way, it's about 19% of our calories come from saturated fat. You go around this little wheel here that makes up all the contribution. You've got cheese and pizza, sausage, what else? Chicken, whole milk, burgers, eggs, reduced milk, beef, butter. Much of it, in fact, I think about half of it is coming, or maybe more than half, is coming from processed foods and animal products. If we look at saturated fat specifically, about half comes from animal sources. So again, beef and other foods. if you look at sodium, we consume on average about 3,400 milligrams a day, 3.4 grams of sodium a day. The upper limit, which is the limit that a Food Nutrition Board establishes as the safe upper limit for consumption daily, is 2,300 milligrams. So we're 1,100 over. The target ought to be about 1,500 milligrams, which is actually pretty low, pretty hard to achieve with the food environment we operate in. But again, if you look at all the contributors, it's going to be, again, processed foods and processed animal products. Those are continuously the major contributors of all the least healthy nutrients in the diet. So again, why is this important in terms of health? You heard about the obesity, quote-unquote, epidemic, right? Over time, we've been consuming more and more calories as they become more and more available to us and cheaper to purchase. This map here, you probably can't see the percentages, but these blue and light blue indicators by state suggest that the populations in these states in 1991, the percentage that was obese was probably 10 to 15% or less in most states. Fast forward to just a few years ago, 2007 to 2009, we got all these new colors, these alarming red and orange colors, which suggest that 25% to 30% or more in most states are considered obese. And that's just the obesity issue. If you include all those people who are considered overweight, we've got 2/3 of American adults who are considered overweight or obese. And excess weight is a risk factor for a lot of issues. So heart disease, some cancers, for example, diabetes, all the major killers in the US. It's not a problem just among adults. If you look at kids, back in 1963 to 1970, about 4 to 5% of children ages 6 to, I think, 19 were considered overweight or obese. But then you fast forward to the turn of the century and the numbers are similar today. You're looking at about 16% of kids age 6 to 19 who are considered overweight or obese. That's a big number, and it's really problematic because the writing begins to be on the wall. 40% of obese children will absolutely become obese adults. 80% of obese teens will absolutely, invariably become obese adults. It's really, really difficult to reverse overweight and obesity. It's really hard, as many people know who have tried diets, to lose weight. That's kind of why there's been so much more of a push towards prevention versus treatment. We've been trying treatment. We've been trying to educate people on how to eat better, and it doesn't help. The obesity rates in terms of increases over time have sort of plateaued recently in the past year or two, but they haven't decreased necessarily. So we've still got a problem that we're not really fixing. And that's just the health side of things. There's also the environmental impact in terms of what we have to do to our food system to make all of this stuff for us to consume and overconsume. And it's really problematic. So let me go through a few things. So I mentioned processed foods and animal products as kind of big contributors to unhealthy aspects of our diet, all of which sort of promoted within our food environment through those sensory aspects I discussed. But food production and the supply of food requires about 15% of all the energy we use in the US each year. And actually that doesn't sound like too much. I mean, given how important food is, right, in our daily lives, 15% of all of our energy use going to that doesn't seem to be too bad. But we could certainly make improvements on how we use that energy. And we certainly have to be more wary of energy use as resources become limited, and when you extrapolate out in terms of impact on the climate. Processed foods, in particular, use a whole lot of energy. So 82 to 92% of all the food that we buy is processed food. So very little of it is actually whole, unprocessed foods. Not very much. The energy used to produce processed foods, both in production and in packaging, of that 15%, it's roughly a quarter of that is used for production and processing and packaging. Okay, so a lot of that energy is actually going into just manipulating the food and then packaging it up for us and getting it to us before we even eat it. So it's a fair amount of energy used. Now when it comes to the actual packaging waste, because all of this packaging results in lots of bags and cardboard boxes, right, and bottles and cans. 31% of all municipal solid waste, all the stuff that goes to the landfill, is packaging waste. Not just food packaging, but packaging in general. But of the packaging waste, 2/3 of that is specifically food packaging. So the majority of it is actually food related. And it's huge considering we produce about 600 pounds of trash a year. So it's an incredible amount of packaging that we produce as waste that just goes into the landfill. And we're trying to recycle more, and that's great, but really recycling rates are very, very minimal, and they're really not much of a solution so far in terms of dealing with all this waste. Plastic bottles are one of the most difficult issues to deal with. And we all use them. We go to Starbucks, we're getting bottles out or whatever, so we all have plastic bottles, and it's just part of our food environment, so it's easy to make use of this stuff. But it's building up in really nefarious ways. So a lot of this waste actually makes its way out into the ocean, and this stuff breaks down partially rather, and produces kind of this plastic shard soup that marine animals and mammals consume and then die. It's killing off a lot of fish and a lot of birds. But one of the things I found interesting about this particular issue, anybody read The Onion? The Onion, I'm fan of The Onion. The Onion is great about taking really serious problems and making it quite clear what the issue is in the funniest of ways. And they had a headline a while back that I thought was perfect, which is this. It reads, "How bad for the environment can throwing away one plastic bottle be? 30 million people wonder." Right? So it kind of captures how we treat this sort of food and beverage waste. Now, if you look at, so that's just sort of the processed food side. If you look at the meat and animal product side, you've got a whole different set of issues, related with different set of issues. There's sort of an animal ethics issue to be considered that I'm not really going to cover here, but we grow and slaughter 10 billion animals a year in the US alone to produce all the meat that we consume and that we ship abroad for other people to consume as well. That's a huge number of animals. And as a result, you're going to have a system that is fraught with issues in terms of how those animals are treated and slaughtered and the issues they deal with. But that's a whole separate issue I'm not even getting into now. So if you're worried about animal ethics, it's something to think about, but we won't even talk about it now. But we have to slaughter that many animals because we eat a lot of meat. 124 kilograms of meat per person per year in the US, which is roughly about 2 people. 2 people's worth. That compared to the worldwide average of about 46 to 47 kilograms of meat consumed. We're not even the biggest per capita meat consumers. It's somewhere in Northern Europe, some tiny country consumes like 145 kilograms per person. They love their sausage there, so I think it's kind of the driver. But, so yeah, so we eat a lot of meat. These are always fun. So if you were to take a 72-year average lifespan for a human, and you translate this into whole animal equivalents, this is what you would eat. About 11 cattle throughout your lifetime, about 3 lambs and sheep, 23 hogs, 45 turkeys, and 1,100 chickens. So that's how many animals you would consume if you lived for about 72 years, eating at a rate of 124 kilograms per year. So you're actually, the back slide. You know what's funny is when I was putting this together, I just like to balance my numbers and my words with pictures to make nice looking slides. And so I randomly picked this picture of this cow to throw up on here. And I feel like the cow is staring out at us accusingly. That's what I'm looking at. Sorry. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of resources required to grow all that meat? So meat is really, really resource intensive. If you look at the agricultural picture in the US, all agriculture combined, not just meat, but crops as well, it requires 50% of the total amount of land in the US to produce all of our food products. And 80% of the US water supply. 80% of our water goes to agriculture specifically. It's an incredible amount of water use. Now it's important to think about that in terms of livestock and meat production because livestock consumes a lot of grain. So you might think all this land being used to grow all these crops, well, that's calories for people. Not so. The vast majority goes to animals both here and abroad to grow, to produce meat. Okay, so livestock actually consume each year about 7 times the grain that an average human would consume. It also takes 100 times the water inputs to produce 1 kilogram of animal protein compared to 1 kilogram of vegetable protein. So the water use, which we all know is a severe problem, especially right now as over half the country is dealing with a drought, is a really serious and growing problem. And it's being all shunted generally into producing animal proteins. Now, to give you an example of that, corn. The US is the major producer of corn in the world, so we produce on average something like 10 of the 23 billion bushels produced around the world each year. Livestock consume 80% of all the corn that we produce. So the rest of that, not even that, the 20%, not even all of that is going to human consumption. A big chunk of that then goes off to ethanol production. And then there's some smaller percentage that goes into actual human consumption. So the vast majority goes to livestock. If you translate that further in terms of kilocalories, so fossil fuel energy, you can imagine the fossil fuel is required for all of this agricultural production. If you translate that in terms of kilocalories per calorie of protein produced, so kilocalories, just think of it in terms of calories, same thing. Generally, it's 25 kilocalories of fossil fuel energy required to produce 1 kilocalorie of protein. All right. Now, if you look at that by various animals, it's actually 40 kilocalories to 1 calorie per cow. A little bit better when you get down to broiler chickens is 4 kilocalories of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 kilocalorie of protein out of chickens. But if you compare that to grain proteins, vegetable proteins, 2.2 calories to 1 pound. So the efficiencies in terms of energy utilization are ridiculously different, right, when it comes to vegetable versus animal proteins. If you translate that one step further and you talk about climate change type gas production, so CO2, carbon dioxide, and you look at the pounds of CO2 produced to produce 1 pound of animal products. If you look at beef, that's the biggest offender there, the biggest red bar. 20 pounds of CO2 are produced for every pound of meat of beef produced. All right? If you look at cheese, for example, almost 11 pounds of CO2 for every pound of cheese produced. Compare that to, say, carrots. 0.2 pounds of CO2 for every pound of carrots produced, or oat flakes and oatmeal, 0.7 pounds of CO2 for every pound of oats produced. Right? So the energy requirements for meat production are just massive. And as a result, problematic when it comes to climate change. And this really can only get worse because as we look at, the presumption now is that this sort of climate change issue is leading to more severe weather. And we look at what's happening right now. You've got more than half the country dealing with drought. That's going to cause a major problem in terms of available crops for sale on the market next year. Those prices rise. Price increases in terms of food worldwide, the way they impact us, they do impact us, but usually it's pretty small, 3 to 5% increase in food prices in general. But the way they impact developing countries is something we don't often think about, but is massive. So in 2008 was the last time there was a major spike in both gas prices and food prices, and we saw food riots around the world. Food riots. That's coming again, possibly depending on what happens with the rest of this year in terms of food production. All right, so this can be a little depressing. There are lots of issues here, both in terms of health and in terms of environmental sustainability. But there are solutions. And I want to go through some of these things, and these are partial solutions. I'm not a climatologist. I'm not an energy scientist. We have plenty of those at ASU who are looking on those issues. But when it comes to food, there's lots that you can do as an individual to minimize your impact on the environment and at the same time improve the health of your diet. And it's in part by thinking of food from a food systems perspective. So I'm going to try and speed up a little bit here without going through all these details. Thinking of food not just in terms of does this taste good, and then one step further, is this actually healthy for me? But then also, how is this food actually produced? Does it make sense for me to be eating these foods given the sorts of issues that we're dealing with nationally and worldwide? And so when you start to think about food from a broader perspective, taking all these things into account, you can start to identify solutions that help you maybe meet goals in these various areas in terms of your personal health and environmental health. One of the proposed solutions is local foods, the local foods movement. That solution is actually flawed because a lot of times people point to that and say, well, local foods, that probably means that we're traveling less and shipping stuff a smaller distance and therefore saving on fossil fuel energy for distribution. That actually turns out to not be the case. You actually, if you were to sort of ramp up local food distribution compared to national distribution of foods, we'd be burning more fossil fuels. Because if you think about small-time farmers and their small, inefficient trucks driving to farmers markets and various locations to drop off their stuff, that whole food miles issue doesn't quite hold up. But there are other good reasons to sort of go local. Most important probably is that most of the time when you're going local, you're getting whole foods. And so right off the bat, you jump over that middle step of processing and packaging and then distribution. Right? So that big chunk of energy use is something that you do away with immediately. And at the same time, you deal with sort of the packaging waste and all those issues. So you also are getting whole foods that are unprocessed, meaning you are probably getting a richer source of nutrients and a broader array of nutrients in the foods that you're consuming. You gain a greater knowledge of the source of your foods. And without going into too much detail, some of the research I've done with people who participate in local foods programs, they actually ascribe sort of more specialness to the food that they get through or from local farmers compared to foods they buy in the grocery store. So if they get carrots through, say, a CSA, a Community Supported Agriculture Program, from a local farmer, those same carrots that they got from the grocery store are less important to them. And they're actually easier to waste, to let go bad compared to the carrots that they get from the local farmer. They feel a moral obligation, so they try to make more use of that food. There's sort of a community connection. That is, you're keeping your dollars within the community. You've heard that argument before, buying local. Being supportive of sustainable production practices. A lot of times, and the movement is these days for these local farmers to produce in more sustainable ways with agroecological concepts and crop rotations and using crops that are perhaps more adapted to the place that they're growing. A lot of that is going on, so you tend to support more and varied agricultural production compared to these huge monocropping situations that are intensive because when you monocrop, you need lots of external inputs to support major monocrop farms. There's also kind of a stronger behavior change message. It's interesting when I talk about these things, when you talk to people about health, eating fruits and vegetables, be healthier, people are like, yeah, I get that. And it kind of, it's a message, I've heard it before, whatever. You combine that with the issues of environmental impact, and that starts to really get to people a lot more. It's sort of a broader issue, and that when I speak to students about this stuff, it seems to inspire them more to try to change how they eat. You throw in the animal ethics issue for those that are interested in that, and that's just like the linchpin. They're vegetarian all of a sudden. So the local foods movement has one potential solution. There are lots of farmers markets out there. That number is growing in the state and nationally. CSAs, which are community-supported agriculture programs, which is what Chow Locally essentially is. And that's usually a situation in which a farm gathers up what they're growing every week into different boxes that people can subscribe to and get on a weekly basis. This is also growing, so there are lots of CSAs in Arizona, and that number is growing nationally as well. And that's really what Chow Locally is all about. So what we do is work with lots of different farms all at once, rather than just one individual farm. And we try to gather a good variety of the best of what's being grown all around the valley. And we only work with farms that we consider to be producing in more sustainable ways. So we try to take all these messages, all these issues, package them up into one box so that you get a variety of fruits and vegetables. You're supporting lots of farmers. You're also, hopefully, then improving your diet because you're eating more whole foods, supporting your community and your farmers, and minimizing your impact on the environment because as you eat more whole foods, you displace the processed and animal products, food products that you have in your diet with the calories coming from healthier foods. So, I'm at 46 minutes.
That's pretty darn good.
My voice is close. So I think what I'll do, though, I'll stop there. I wanted to kind of give you sort of a philosophy of the food system ideology and talk about how that related to Chow Locally. But I'm happy to answer any questions related to the science or to Chow Locally. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Anybody have questions?
Not really a question, but as you were talking about advertising and proximity, I was reminded, I've read several times about the way grocery stores put their end aisles together. And they put things that might not necessarily be on sale, but if we stick the chips and the cereal not in those aisles but on the end, you're more likely to buy them as you're going by.
Yeah, there are all these strategies, and I'm just learning about some of them from doing some work with fashion, but there are all these strategies about how to place things at the aisle caps and then within aisles as well. My favorite example, check this out next time you go to a grocery store. It's usually in the cereal aisle at one end. All the gummy products for kids, so like the fruit roll-ups and little packages of gummy thingies, whatever. There are dozens of them. It's incredible. There's like a whole section. And just see where things are placed.
They're
usually kids. Yeah. So sugary cereals and the gummy products are usually often kid height. There's the grocery store that's near me. I actually took pictures of this. I don't have it in this presentation, but there are so many of them that they fill the whole aisle. So it's like 4 or 5 shelves worth of the gummy products. But I was noticing, so one of the big trends in selling foods to kids is using licensed characters. So finding Nemo, like little Nemo fish, for example, or I just forget the names of the new cartoons out there.
SpongeBob, we do like SpongeBob, Dora,
Yes. Exactly, thank you. Actually, I thought SpongeBob and SquarePants were 2 different characters for a long time. But yeah, so if you look at the gummy products, all the ones with licensed characters are at the bottom. And then the ones that are sort of generic are at the top. So the ones that will catch the kids' eyes, that will sell most for the kids, are usually at the bottom. And the food industry actually has a term for this. They call it pester power. So there's placement of food products such that kids will pester their parents to buy the chocolate products. And that's big money. They actually have numbers assigned to, pester power.
It reminds me of another ad, actually, for it's either fruit roll-ups or some gummy thing, and the mom's in the grocery store, and the kid in the ad in the commercial is actually going, "Mom, I want this, I want this, I want this," and that is what the commercial is. And finally, she puts it in the cart. Drove me crazy. First time I saw it, I was like, "Are you kidding me?"
Yeah.
So, but I bet it works.
Well, parents in here, that's not okay. I don't want to deal with your children when they grow up. Just saying.
Well, I keep thinking of my child. I look at my kids and I go, if you ever did that to me in the grocery store, I would walk out of the grocery store.
Yes.
So, I read the book, what was it, The Omnivore's Dilemma or something, and they have a chapter in there about Whole Foods, the store, versus the grocery stores. And that there actually is a lot that is kind of twisted in a Whole Foods store, as in addition to, like, you already know grocery stores are trying to do stuff to make you buy stuff, but that there's a lot of falsehood in organic and stuff like that. So can you speak a little bit to what really determines whether something's organic, and is Whole Foods really, like a store like Whole Foods or a store like Sprouts, like, are they really that different, or is there some stuff in there that's not quite true either?
Yeah, so lots of good points there. With Whole Foods and Sprouts and stores like that, I think I don't know, they may do a better job of trying to source some of their stuff locally, but they certainly have a customer base and a need for variety, so they will never be, truly supportive of local production in particular. When it comes to the issue of organic in general, so organic is one of the terms that you can actually have a little bit more confidence in, at least in terms of how it's regulated. So it's a federal program, USDA organic, so it's USDA that regulates it. And if you see 100% organic on the label, then you know that all the ingredients in that product are actually organically grown. To the extent that that is important to you. So there's regulation in terms of what it means to be organic as well, that some farmers would contend are not that strong. Others would say it's great, but that's a different issue, I guess. There's also gradations of that, so it can say made with organic ingredients, and I believe that's something like maybe 70% organic ingredients or less. So you should be able to see that labeling on there. But there's also this issue of greenwashing. So there are lots of labeling systems out there that might be the grocery stores in particular, might be some nonprofit that isn't necessarily well regulated, and so you don't really know what those terms mean. You might see humanely raised. There's no real FDA or USDA regulation behind that, so you don't know unless you probably know the farmer. And so it's not possible for all of us, but to the extent that you can actually meet people who produce your food, there are, at farmers markets around here, there are some meat vendors, for example, whose practices I know to be really good. So JH, for example, and Double Check Ranch, they sell their meats at farmers markets in the area. You can talk to them about how they raise their animals, the inputs that go into it, how they're slaughtered, who slaughters them. So you actually can learn this stuff. And I think it's the best way to kind of overcome this issue of greenwashing, which is really just selling people on more messaging. With Michael Pollan, who wrote Omnivore's Dilemma, he talks about this nutritionism issue, which is like that Cocoa Puffs package there, where you have all this messaging about nutrition on it. You're taking nutrient information and essentially using it as an advertising strategy to sell your product. The greenwashing thing is the same idea. So anytime you have packaging, you've got messaging, you should probably be wary right off the bat. I mean, the way that you know if food is healthy is if you have to wash it and peel it versus like unpackage it and dump it out. You're probably on the right track, right?
If you want a good laugh, go look at the Baby Ruth candy bars. Now it has a little section on the bottom that says now it contains 4 grams of protein.
Yeah. Already had 4 grams because it had peanuts in it. I would say a good example of that is Kashi. They just got in trouble because they have the whole healthy line. Everyone thinks Kashi is healthy, and Kashi actually was like 80% genetically modified crop that they use. My favorite. And none of it's organic. They don't have an organic sale anyway, but that's what they promoted, and that's hogwash.
I do wish they would get more specific about what they mean by organic, because like literally, if you go to Whole Foods and I say, can you show me the inorganic bananas, it's like they suddenly are in a conundrum. It's like, can you show me the inorganic chickens? And there's no such thing, it's just that.
Yeah, I feel more confidence, and I'm not an agricultural expert when it comes to actual farming practices, so I know generally about organic practices or not. And I feel more confident when it comes to fruits and vegetables than I do meat or animal products. Most of the time, organic when it comes to animal products was the animal-fed and organic feed. It has nothing to do, when people think about labeling in relation to animal products, I think usually they're thinking about treatment of the animals along with the health of the product and things like that. But there's nothing to do with treatment of animals when it comes to organic labeling. There are some certifications out there that are probably more reliable than others when it comes to humanely raised type labeling. But yeah, when it comes to organic, like chicken or eggs or beef or whatever, it's a wash to me. I don't think it's even all that important.
One last question. Anybody have a last question?
Yes.
Since we have a nutritionist here, that gluten-free stuff, has it gone too far?
Yeah, it has. Gluten-free's gone too far.
Not if you're gluten intolerant, has it?
If you're gluten intolerant, that's one thing, but a lot of people presume that they are when they are not. So what happens, this is a weird phenomenon. It's not a new thing. It's been going on since we've begun obsessing about food, which really actually started in the early 1900s with people like Charles Post and Harvey Kellogg and the Road to Wellville and that kind of stuff. But we tend to like to focus on, it's the magic bullet syndrome. We tend to like to focus on a particular nutrient and say, that nutrient sucks. Cut it out and we'll be healthier, we'll lose weight, and we're good to go. And so, for a while there, it was fat. Once we learned about the impact of saturated fats on cholesterol, and then we had the snack wells effect where people would buy all these foods that were filled with carbohydrate and still get fat because they overconsume the carbohydrate, which gets converted to fat if you overconsume calories. Right, so then it became carbohydrates, and then we had the high protein diets like Atkins and South Beach and these sorts of things. And these days it tends to be there's a gluten focus. I don't buy it. I mean, there is a subset of the population that has to deal with food allergies and food intolerances, and that's important to get diagnosed if you have that issue. But most people have a set of issues that might be related to other health problems, and they self-diagnose as gluten intolerant. And these days, I don't even know if people are doing that. They just see these products and assume they're somehow healthier, which they're not necessarily. So yeah, I think it's not too far.
And see, one of the things with the gluten-free products, it's actually gluten-free because it's inflammatory for me. It causes pain and an issue that I have. And they add sugar and fats to all of those gluten-free things to make them more appealing and taste better. So they're actually counterproductive as far as health goes, unless you have celiac. I mean, there's no just gluten. I think the most important thing is to eat clean food. The thing the closest to the original seed, of the product is important. So if you're eating gluten-free pizza crust, that's not going to be compared to eating something that was freshly ground from very simple ingredients. So.
Yeah. The more you're cooking at home, which I recognize is labor and it's time intensive, although it doesn't have to be, but the more you cook at home, the more you know what goes into your food, the better you are in understanding what you're eating.
Well, I'm celiac, but anyway, I wasn't diagnosed until I was 28, so I know how sick you can be from food. I think a different way to look about food is not what's like you take out of it, but what is in it, and that's just a whole different way to look at what can I eat. And people with celiac or really any intolerance can eat fruit and vegetables. They can eat pure meats and things so it's really all the stuff you're not supposed to eat anyway that makes you sick, that makes probably everybody sick. Yeah. So it's not just people with intolerances.
Yeah. And in general, when it comes to dietary advice, if it's not coming from nutrition scientists, be wary in the first place. People selling books and diet plans, be wary. But even when it comes from government, like the food guide pyramid, when we used to have that before my plate, the bottom of the pyramid was grains, right? Eat 6 to 11 grains, servings of grains. Why? Who says that that's what we should be eating? There's really, actually, to be totally honest, you go back and look at research behind this, there's no scientific evidence to suggest this should be the base of your diet. Plant foods in general, yes, but grains specifically being predominant, no reason. It's not a bad thing unless you have maybe intolerances, but otherwise there's nothing specifically to say that's how you should build your diet.
It's also everybody has incentives. Water companies have incentives to tell you have to drink how much water a day. Like you're being marketed to in every fashion, like healthy, not healthy. It's all marketing if you ask me.
And the great thing about Whole Foods is that you overcome all of that. You buy a cantaloupe, maybe you have to worry about the cantaloupe board in California or something, I don't know. They exist, I'm sure. But yeah, otherwise you overcome the advertising and the processing and the packaging and you start to eat pretty simple, straightforward, understandable food.
And you always have that situation where George Burns outlives Jack LaLanne.
Well, that's probably a genetic issue more than anything else.
I appreciate all the facts and figures that as far as how these things have to be made. I think that's actually probably the most important thing for me to have looked at.
The one thing I would say about that is when you see like marathon runners drop dead at 45, and you're like, oh, it doesn't help. Well, maybe that person had a heart condition, like an actual heart defect that resulted in that. Maybe that person would have died at 24, had they not been active in the first place. So those sorts of genetic issues, that's always kind of a trump card. But in general, all things being equal, eating a diet that's more based on whole food is going to be
All right. Well,
all right.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
And I want to let you know, too, that Chow Locally does do a drop-off here at Gangplank every Monday evening, is it? Okay. And is it chowlocally.com? Is that the website? So if you want to check that out. And next week, we have the gorgeous Stephanie Leibel joining us for a brown bag. Yay! She's so excited about it. I tell you, she can't stop talking to me about it. And Jay is waving evaluations at me. Say something, Jay.
We passed out evaluations. Would appreciate it if you could fill those out, give us some feedback, and then give them to me.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
That part I didn't do my card.